This morning, I want to talk to you about some trends in modern warfare and what that means for ethical decision-making and ethical leadership, but also talk to you about what happens when we get it wrong. I put this in every presentation to military audiences because I think too many people forget this. Our first business is war. We are the only ones who are charged with defending our country with lethal force. No one else has the legal authority to use lethal force as a deliberate and first option. But it also imposes on us a very profound ethical and moral responsibility, which, as is explained in ADF P0 leadership and the military ethics doctrine, which we developed when I was Commandant of the Australian Defence College, it talks about ethical leadership being the most important factor in ensuring the legitimacy of our operations and the support of the Australian people. I think that's would be an uncontested statement in this audience, and it shouldn't be a contested statement. I think it's a statement of fact. But how do we reconcile them? At the end of the day, if we're charged with using lethal force, if we're under an existential threat, as we're seeing some are around the world, and we could be at some point in the future, how do we reconcile both the first business is war and ethical leadership? So I guess that's the core question that you'll be considering there over the course of the day. For me, I'll talk about what does war look like now? What are some of the ethical elements of that? And then what is the price of getting it wrong, whether it's the physical, the intellectual, or the moral elements of fighting a war? So I'll cover several trends. Firstly, I'd like to talk about this trend of the signature battle and how we see a deeper meshing of civil and military sensor frameworks for surveillance, but also for strike. It means that the time between detection and destruction is much, much shorter than ever. Commanders spend less time making decisions that have lethal outcomes. What are the implications of that? Because at the moment, we have gone from an environment, when I was a brigade commander, we planned on about 10 minutes from when you were seen to when you could be hit. Now it's about 1 minute. How do you make good decisions in less than a minute unless it's already planned? And what are the ethics of doing that? So this signature battle will have a profound impact on decision-making and ethical decision-making. It means also that surprise becomes much harder, massing is much more difficult. And I guess the ethical challenges, at least at the first level, are, just because we can see and kill something, should we kill it? What is the real military value of doing that? This isn't a new question, but we can see more and kill more than we've ever been able to before. And the other thing too is, well, how far does the moral responsibility to defend our own troops defend? How much effort can and should we dedicate in this environment to the protection of our troops, to the destruction of enemy troops? The Chief of Army has talked about defensive drones against drones as a moral responsibility. I agree with him. But how much effort can we afford to expend in a small organisation? A second important trend is what I call democratised digital command and control. Now, the Australian Army, I think, has a pretty unfortunate record when it comes to digitised command and control. We've been messing around with this since OzTax in the early 1990s. We had BCSS in the late 90s, which was pretty good, but then we all went to war for a decade and forgot about it. We then invested in Albert, which employed hundreds of Australian engineers to produce a world-leading solution, which then Defence decided it didn't want, even though the British and the Americans use it. And we're now using Citaware. We are way behind, decades behind. And we are seeing the Ukrainians really leap ahead in the distributed use of lots of different forms of integrated, digitized command and control to the individual level. That's why I call it democratise. This is down to the individual. If you have a look at our brigades at the moment, we are nowhere near that. We're lucky if we have it at the combat team level. So there's a whole range of outcomes of this digitised command and control. In particular, it gives individuals access to call for fire, to put in enemy locations, and these kind of things, which can cause issues if they're not accurate. So how does our current training and education cover the ethical issues of this new environment where every single individual has vastly increased access to situational awareness, but also the ability to input data? What is the assurance levels? What are our mechanisms for that? So they're not putting in data that they think is red, but is actually blue. And I think a really important question is it healthy for all our people to see so much of the battlefield? How much vicarious trauma might we be causing to people by delegating down to the lowest level digitised command and control system? Now, there's lots of good reasons to do this. For mission command, for disaggregated operations when we lose our command and control networks and communications network. But there are some ethical and other challenges to do with this approach. A third important trend, I think, is the one that people in the media and many military analysts tend to gravitate towards, is the ubiquity of uncrewed systems. No one really predicted this explosion, this Cambrian explosion of autonomous, semi-autonomous and remotely controlled systems we've seen during the war. And it's really started on day one, where a bunch of civilian drone operators basically got in contact with a few of their mates in the National Guard and territorial forces of the Ukrainians as the Russians began their advance and their air operations into Hostomel, and offered their services, and it's exploded from there. And whilst a lot of people are focused on the dozens of different types of aerial systems, there has also been arguably an even more important acceleration in the development and deployment of maritime drones and semi-autonomous and autonomous strike systems. And more recently, in the last 6 months, we're starting to see the widespread deployment of support and combat uncrewed ground vehicles. I think this will be an important trend over the next year or two, particularly as both the Russians and Ukrainians have to deal with the impact of the very large-scale human casualties that they suffered in the first 28 months of this war. But that said, there's a range of different challenges, and I don't think anyone in this audience are new to these when it comes to autonomous and semi-autonomous or remotely controlled systems. I mean, should humans be in or on the loop in killing other humans? This is a question I think that we've been talking about for some time now, and I don't know that we've come up with satisfactory answers, other than the Ukrainians and the Russians have just gone out and done it in many respects. It's a challenge for everyone on the battlefield because everyone has drones and everyone is a target of drones. These are not the kind of things that there's a couple of dozen of. Just, you know, the ADF has a few hundred of these things. That's how many you have per square kilometre in Ukraine. So everyone's a target and everyone's an operator. And if drone-on-drone combat becomes more combat at the strategic and political levels, is it easier for politicians to resort to war? Drone-on-drone combat in Ukraine is now unremarkable, whether it's aerial drones. There's lots of FPVs that attack the Baba Yaga Ukrainian drones. You see FPVs attacking UGVs all the time. You see Russian aerial drones attacking Ukrainian semi-submersible maritime drones. This is now normal. And what does that mean for the future of warfare if it becomes an easier decision for politicians to resort to force? I think a fourth trend is the return to mass. I talked about this at some length in my book, War Transformed, a couple of years ago before the war started. A lot of people thought I was smoking the crack pipe, but the trends were very clear then that we were returning to an era of mass use of military forces and indeed the mobilization of societies for war. We've seen this in Ukraine. We've certainly seen it in the Russians. They led the way in mobilizing their entire society. Their entire society is on a war footing, as is Israeli society at the moment. And you are seeing the shift to this with more countries reinstituting or instituting national service, like Sweden and countries in Europe, and countries that already have national service where it's unremarkable, unlike our own country, like Singapore and Taiwan and Korea, really looking at their national service models to make them more efficient, more effective. And the final element of this mobilisation of mass that we're seeing is industrial capacity. We are seeing the rebirth of defence industries that have lain fallow for 30 years in Europe and the United States. We don't have a lot of choice here. The Chinese and the Russians have a productive capacity, whether it's munitions or ships or drones, that vastly outstrip ours. It is not a good status for us to be in if we wish to deter future conflict. So I think there's a few ethical challenges here around conscription. We've seen this debate in our country, and I think it's not a very well-informed debate. It's a debate we absolutely must have. But unfortunately, it often is a debate that comes from the lunatics on the far left who think it's not ethical to force people to serve their country. Now, this is an argument with very little evidence, given democracies compel their citizens to do all kinds of things. We compel our citizens to vote. We compel our citizens to pay tax. We compel our citizens to obey the law or obey road rules. This is a very similar construct, particularly if the national service model is not a military-centric one, but a community-centric one with a focus on joining 18-year-olds to their communities. I think, too, that the idea of mass versus clever tactics is something we need to look at because although we may criticise the Russians for their meat tactics, all of us throughout our military history have employed similar kinds of tactics. And indeed, we may have no other option but to do so again in the future. What is the ethical framework that we might apply to those kind of considerations? And finally, I think there's a really interesting paper to be written looking at the strategic versus tactical ethics of Russian meat tactics. Whilst we could make lots of good arguments that it's bad tactics and bad ethics to waste individual lives as the Russians are, strategically, you could also make an argument that it is very ethical to do that if it prevents you from losing a war. Now, there's also lots of conversations that we could have about the ethical basis of that war. We all, I think, accept that the ethical basis of the Russian war is not there. But I think there's a really interesting discussion and paper that might be written there. A final trend I think is really important. It's got nothing to do with equipment. It's about how we learn, how we adapt as organisations. We've seen, I think, a really interesting case study in the Ukraine war of both sides learning and adapting in uneven ways and at different speeds at the tactical and strategic levels. Now, tactical adaptation is about learning to win battles and sharing the lessons to do so across your organisation. Strategic adaptation is about learning to support winning the overall war. And both are important, but linking the two is even more important. And we've seen the Ukrainians and Russians both improve their capacity to do so. Every time I visit Ukraine, I ask this question in different organisations. What are your learning mechanisms? How do you share lessons? How do you flow them up into the system so it changes doctrine, so it changes tactics and training, so it changes things like infrastructure and equipment and munitions production? And every time I ask that question, I get a better answer. And I think it's important to note that no matter how we see future war, the military that we start the next war with will not be the one that wins it. That's because, firstly, we learn and we change and adapt. We change our organisation. We change our structures, our tactics and equipment. But secondly, generally, the first year of most wars sees most or a large proportion of the existing military killed or wounded. So we need to have a think about what that might mean for us in the future. I think there's a couple of really interesting ethical questions. How quickly and should lessons be shared? I've seen incidences where in Ukrainian brigades, they haven't shared lessons with the next brigade that's on the line with them. I've seen personal examples when I was in Afghanistan. We would share lessons with our allied partners that we're in Tarank out with, and they wouldn't absorb them, and they would lose people. So, you know, I think there's a really important ethical dimension towards learning and adaptation that we need to be thinking about. So I'd like to conclude with a brief examination of failure in modern war. I think this is something that we need to really be looking at closely, because whilst we have previously studied failures in wars of the 20th century, and there are many enduring lessons from there are some unique elements of the last 2+ decades that we also need to layer over the top. I think the battle for Kiev in 2022 is a wonderful case study of an underestimated opponent beating an overestimated military organization. There's lots of different causes that went into the Russian defeat north of Kiev, but there were a huge array of strategic fallouts that benefited Ukraine and saw Russia really on the back foot. So this is a small dog versus big dog lesson, which the Australian military, as a small dog, should be learning from. But the Ukrainians have also provided examples of failure. The Ukrainian 2023 counteroffensive is an example of institutional failure, where some people thought that you could raise, train, sustain a brand new brigade and put it into high-level combat operations in 6 months. That clearly just is not possible. And the Ukrainians proved that, unfortunately. But I also think we need to ask the question about the doctrine they were trained in from the West. I think it's out of date, and we haven't really done the hard intellectual thinking of how we might retain an advantage in offensive operations. We're not there yet. But like the battle for Kiev, this had a range of strategic outcomes that were quite negative for the Ukrainians. Everything from the civil military crisis of 2023-24, the reputational damage, and the debate in the US Congress. Another failure is Israel on the 7th of October. Having visited there, spoken to the people in the kibbutzim that were attacked, spoken to senior military and intelligence and government officials about this. There are an array of different lessons that we really need to be studying hard in here. And like the other two, a bunch of different strategic impacts that continue to reverberate through to this day and will probably for decades to come. And finally, I think we absolutely must continue to focus on what I would describe as the most profound, sustained command and leadership failure in the history of the Australian Defence Force. For over a decade, our special forces basically went rogue, murdered dozens of people outside the heat of battle, and there has been no accountability of any, not one, senior military officer because of it. This is absolutely stunning in a democracy. If you go back to other similar incidences in Iraq with the Americans or in Somalia with the Canadians, not only were there investigations like Burton, but there was wholesale removals of commanders who were accountable. This wasn't about whether they directed it. This was about basic accountability in military institutions. You are accountable. If you are the commander of an organization, you are accountable, whether you know about it or not, about everything that happens. And we appear to have forgotten this in our institution. And, you know, as a result of that, I think we are a lesser ADF, and we are certainly a lesser army, because we are not holding people accountable for the most awful of actions against innocent civilians. And the question I would pose to you is that if we're unable to appropriately address ethical failures in the Burton report, how do we address potential ethical failures resulting from trends in modern war? I think we owe our soldiers much, much better than this. So that concludes my presentation. I wish I could be there with you. It would certainly be warmer back in my home state, than it is down in Canberra. But it's a very important seminar that's being pulled together here. Debates and the discussions you happen are at the core of our profession, and I wish you well with them. Thank you.
So, Lieutenant Frederick Carter, 20 Regiment. My question is, does the geography of the Ukraine make it easier for them to use autonomous ground vehicles and autonomous air and sea vehicles? And noting that our conflict may be in the Pacific, how much of an impact will the geography of the Pacific have on the types of UAS that we can use, noting that it would be very difficult to use an FPV drone in the jungles of the South Pacific?
No, it's a good question. And I've started a project that looks at how do you translate the lessons of Ukraine into the Pacific theatre. Because at the end of the day, whilst there are an array of very important lessons that can come out of Ukraine, the terrain, the weather, the geography, the politics, the civil infrastructure of the Western Pacific and Southwest Pacific are different. But I think those lessons still hold true. All of those lessons will hold true. They will just be manifested in very different ways. For example, in our region, I think that, we have lots of small boat builders in Australia. Those maritime attack drones that the Ukrainians have are long range and are very useful. Too many people, when they think of the Pacific, just think of the Central Pacific. Well, we're not going to be fighting there. There's nothing there worth fighting for. There's no people there. The fighting will be in the Western Pacific, in the littoral areas within 1,000 kilometres of all the green bits, also known as the land where the people are. So that's the area we really need to focus on. That's the area that we'll be fighting over. And that's the area we really need to translate the various lessons from Ukraine over. I think the ADF has been extraordinarily slow and deficient in learning from Ukraine. The Defence Strategic Review didn't even mention it once. I think the National Defence Strategy mentioned it a couple of times, but if you have a look at other regional partners, the Singaporeans, the Koreans, the Japanese, the Taiwanese, they have done extensive and detailed studies of the lessons from Ukraine, which is informing their defence strategies. We just haven't done the same level of due diligence, and we've been unwilling, despite my offers, to send any ADF people into Ukraine to learn the lessons. It's nowhere near as dangerous as some will tell you. I just buy a train ticket and turn up in Kiev and get out and do this stuff. We should have people on the ground, including an embassy and a defence attaché, to better flow through the lessons, because the Ukrainians are keen to share them with us.
Thanks, sir. Our next question is from Wing Commander Conroy. Interested in a bit of a deeper dive on lessons on the way of soldiers both individually making decisions in a tactical environment and how they relate as a team with this change, both situational awareness, but also the potential to provide their own information and insights into the battlefield. What's your sense of the psychological experience for those team members, and also whether you think there's any lessons for us in a potential change to command structures or decision making?
There's a few different bits of that. Firstly, the psychological preparation of soldiers is something that the Ukrainians have really focused in on very hard. They have a military command that just does this under General Cove, who I spent some time with last October. I've shared with various people the new doctrine that the Ukrainians have produced on psychological resilience, and basically the entire doctrine and lesson plans for their soldiers, their junior leaders, their mid-ranking leaders in building resilient teams and individuals. It's really some great work. I'm not sure there's been a huge amount of interest in the ADF because, once again, I think there's a bit of arrogance there. But they've done an amazing amount of work just on this alone. And if you don't follow him on LinkedIn, General Kochklav is well worth following, and I wrote some stuff on him last year. Broadly, when it comes to structural reform, I think that the ADF at the moment looks exactly like the ADF that came out of World War II when they did a review to say what should the post World War II Australian military look like, which was basically a navy based on 2 aircraft carriers and a few destroyers. We kind of looked like that. Didn't mention submarines at the time. The 3 brigades and a division, and I think 3 to 6 fighter squadrons. I mean, we really haven't substantially changed since then, and I think in many respects we're an intellectually lazy organisation. We're not leading the way when it comes to thinking about new organisations or warfighting concepts like you're seeing in places like the UK or France or the United States or Japan or Ukraine. We've seen in Ukraine an institutional response where they formed a new drone service. Whether that is the right response or not, I don't know, but new technologies are often followed by new organisations and new tactics. We saw this with tanks and armoured divisions, aircraft and air forces, although I still think forming air forces was a strategic error by most countries, and navies and armies should own all aircraft. That was a joke.
Any Raffies in the room? Sorry.
But, new technologies and new problems should drive new institutional and organisational and doctrinal solutions. I see some countries doing this. I don't see our country doing it as much as it really needs to.
Our next question is from Colonel Weller. What are the ethical responsibilities of the CDF when advising government in going to war or joining a conflict, to country, the cabinet and to ADF personnel?
Thanks, Charles. There's probably about a 3-day answer in that, but I mean, obviously you break it down into ethical decision-making about going to war. And for the CDF, he is an advisor. He doesn't make the decision, but he must provide best military advice to the government. And when we talk about government, the reality is to the Prime Minister. Yes, he'll work through the Defence Minister, but the reality is in our system, the CDF is selected by the PM, and when things get tough, works to the PM. So he has to have a good relationship with the Prime Minister, whoever it is, and needs to provide best military advice based on military capacity, but also the laws and values of the military institution that he's leading in the kind of advice to go to war. And then he needs to give best advice in war. And that could be everything from who we should work with, what the rules of engagement when we work with allies might be, where we should have our people. But also it goes to how do you mobilise, in a military sense, a nation's fighting capacity? Because at the end of the day, if something does happen to the north of us, we are probably going to have to go through some form of mobilisation activity, and the CDF will have to be part of the debate on the efficiency, the effectiveness and the ethical basis for mobilising young Australians and not so young Australians to fight for their country. And then the third element is war termination. There's a bunch of different ethical concerns about war termination. I can guarantee if the CDF sits in the room with the Cabinet for National Security, he is the only one that's even thought or read anything about that. I guarantee it, 100%. So in many of these discussions, he will be the only one with any form of military and strategic nous, and he will be the only one that might have considered the ethical elements of the military use of force. So, he has to not just understand all of these issues about going to war, in war, and terminating war, but to be able to communicate them very clearly and in a very compelling way with the members of Cabinet and the Prime Minister of our country. This is a very big ask of any CDF, which goes to the importance of getting the selection of the CDF as right as we possibly can.
Thanks, sir. The next question is from Dr. Till Whitehold. We don't have clear usage rules for unmanned aerial systems or counter-unmanned aerial systems. How can we be ready for a conflict that will likely heavily depend on them?
No one's really, I think, sorted out the tactics for the use of these things, except for maybe the Ukrainians and Russians, because you have to integrate traditional combined arms, because that doesn't go out the window. One of the big lessons from the Ukrainians is normal combined arms still matters. Drones and EW just add to it. But our doctrine, I think, needs to be re-looked at in that light. But if we don't, you know what? Our people will find a way to use them appropriately in war, and hopefully we'll learn from that. At the end of the day, our people at the front line, and I still do a lot of stuff with different army brigades, are pretty innovative, and they're actually pretty keen to win and survive. And that will drive innovation and adaptation. Generally, you're not going to get that kind of innovation from a staff officer in a cubicle in Canberra, because their biggest problem is how to move emails from box A to box B. Soldiers at the coalface have problems every day, and we should be listening to them about potential solutions.
Thanks, sir. The next question is also from Colonel Weller. What are the ethics of ensuring victory? Does that change the ethical calculus for a country and for a military? How far can we go?
I think the most unethical thing you can do is not seek victory. And I think that's one of the great problems with support to Ukraine at the moment, is we're there to defend them. And I think that is a strategically corrupt concept, because it's guaranteeing the war goes longer and more Ukrainians die. I don't think that's ethical. The most ethical thing you can do is, if you find yourself in a war, because generally Australia, the United States and others generally don't pick these fights, they're forced upon us, you have to be 100% committed to victory. Otherwise, just give up, because the in-between space is intellectually and strategic corrupt, it's ethically corrupt, and our people deserve better than that. So you either dedicate yourself to victory or you give up. I don't see any space in between.
Thanks, sir. The next question is from someone who's not given their name. I wonder if the content is why. I'm going to adjust it slightly as I go. How are Ukrainian political leaders and military commanders preparing for a potential Trump presidency?
Yeah. Well, everyone's doing that. There's no secret there. I think there's various mechanisms. Clearly, President Zelensky is reaching out to President Trump. He spoke to him after the assassination attempt, and they've arranged to have a meeting. That's a good sign that at least they can have a meeting. I mean, Zelensky's cleverly not writing off a future Trump administration, if indeed he does win the election. And, you know, that's not a dead certainty. We've already had 4 major surprises in the last month. There's more to come, I'm sure, before Election Day in November. So the Ukrainians are obviously wanting to build a good relationship with them, as well as a future Harris or whoever the Democratic nominee is. But also, you know, they're working very hard with their European allies to build up a European defence base. They're also working very hard to build up their own industrial base. In April, when I was there, had a really good session with the Minister of Strategic Industries, Minister Kamyshin. You know, they tripled defence production in 2022 with their indigenous capacity, with munitions and drones and other things. They doubled it again last year, and they're doubling it again this year. So by the end of this year, they'll be in a position, you know, to make something around 2 million drones a year. They are partnering with European firms for the maintenance and building of defence equipment, with Rheinmetall, the Turks with drones, and a bunch of others. So they're kind of hedging and doing a whole range of things just in case the Americans go a bit wobbly. The reality is, however, this is existential for the Ukrainians. They know what happens if the Russians take over this country. They're seeing what the Russians are doing in occupied areas. Read Jade McClynn's most recent report is a very good examination of this. So even if the Americans walk away, I don't think the Ukrainians are going to give up. They just think the worst option is losing to the Russians, and fighting on without the Americans is probably still a better option.
Thanks, sir. This is becoming the Colonel Weller General Ryan dialogue. We have had the strategic corporal. What are the ethical challenges of the tactical PM or president? How can militaries adapt and handle this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a few dimensions of this. Firstly, this is about how good the CDF is about communicating and bounding those conversations with the Prime Minister and then other ministers of government. So I think that's important. He kind of has to bound those conversations and keep them at the interface between politics and strategy. I mean, CDF doesn't do politics, but he has to be politically aware and able to work in that interface. one of the problems we have in our country is we don't have any civil military doctrine. We started work on a book when I was at ADC on this, but I think it's kind of gone the way of the dodo. So we really need to look at what's the theory of civil military affairs in Australia, and for the ADF, what is the theory and practice of its three key relationships, being the relationship with government, the relationship with the public service, and the relationship with the Australian people. If we can at least think that through, write it down, you have a foundational model which senior leaders can apply and adapt in both peacetime and wartime. I think that is a very significant gap in defence policy and theories of national defence in Australia that we should be redressing.
Thanks, sir. A question from Captain Ben Costello. So what ethical implications do you think apply to civilian resistance in modern war? What questions should professional armies apply in supporting them?
Well, I mean, you look at the early days of the war in Ukraine, it was just come and pick up a weapon, go kill a Russian, and that was it. We could be in the same case at some point in the future. So you need to think those things through well before a conflict. But I think the Geneva Conventions are very clear about what is a combatant. International law is very clear on what's a combatant and what's not a combatant. So, if civilians are engaging in military operations against an adversary, they become a legitimate military target. It's as simple as that. And if civilians engage in aggression against us, they become a legitimate target for us. So I think international law and the Geneva Conventions cover off on this quite adequately. We just need to make sure we're familiar with it.
Thanks, sir. Another question from Wing Commander Conroy. There's a battle for dominance of the conversation at the front here. What historical lessons on the nature of war do current leaders need to internalise in order to make more ethical and effective decisions using force today?
At the end of the day, Clausewitz's enduring nature of war, I think, is a very important idea, that regardless of the amount of technology that might be present, there's always going to be uncertainty. There's always going to be surprise. And I think that's part of what the military has to communicate to both government and our society, is that there are no high-tech solutions that remove danger or uncertainty or surprise from the modern battle space, which is why we need to study failure, I think. A failure is still possible and it will occur. And they need to really internalise that, because at the end of the day, the best military in the world still loses some battles. That's going to happen. Doesn't mean it has to end the war, but you're going to take losses. If you engage in armed conflict, your own people are going to die. And you can't go all wobbly, and you need to keep your eye on the bigger picture, as tragic as every single individual loss is to our country and to their families.
Thanks, sir. I actually have a follow-up. What are the lessons that you think we were too slow to learn in Afghanistan?
The need for a strategy is one. We never really had one, either us or the Americans. And I know I worked as a strategic advisor to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. We had multiple strategies that we kind of bounced between when it was convenient. Sometimes it was counterinsurgency, sometimes it was nation building, sometimes it was counter-terrorism, and I'm sure there was a few others out there. So we never really had a strategy. And if you don't have a strategy, what's the real goal here? So I think that's a massive lesson that we had 20 years to learn, and I don't think we ever really did. Secondly, I think that the government kind of went, oh, well, we'll just contract this out to the ADF. We don't need to raise taxes. We don't really need to have an information campaign to tell the Australian people what's going on here. So I think that government strategic communications and influence was almost entirely absent throughout the war, and except for the 1 week period around Senate estimates twice a year, it was largely forgotten. Now, for professional soldiers, that's fine. That's the life of a professional soldier all the way back to the Roman times, right? Your society doesn't really give a shit about you when you're at war most of the time. But I think government has a bigger responsibility to its people to explain how armed force is being applied in its name. It wasn't being applied in the name of the Australian Army, it was being applied in the name of our country, and I think the government did a really poor job of communicating why that was happening, how it was happening, when it was happening, where it was happening throughout the war. So I think they're two really important lessons. I think another important lesson we learned that was, once getting back to this, the army you start with is not the one you end with. I think our army actually was very good for the most part at learning and adapting throughout the war. If we have a look at what we looked like in 01, all the efforts we went through to adapt everything from adaptive army and a bunch of other things, I think we showed the ability to learn, to reorganise, to re-equip in a way that said a lot of good things about the army and its people in particular. And I think that's also an important lesson.
Thanks, sir. A question from Lieutenant Fred Carter. Sir, how can we remove the bloat from the ADF to enable the changes you've spoken about in preparing us for war? I'll leave everyone in the room to assume what is meant by bloat.
Yeah, I mean, we all know it's worse than bloat, I think. You're being very kind with that term. When I looked at this issue just a couple of months ago, in the last 5 years, we've formed more than a battalion's worth of new senior officer positions in Canberra. And before that, it was the same over the preceding decade. This is a strategic tendency in Canberra that if there's a problem, throw a new 1 or 2 star or a 3 star at it. 25 years ago, there were 22 2 stars in the ADF. And the ADF was no smaller than what it is now. There is a culture that's formed in Canberra and in this country more generally about risk aversion, and the way to avoid risk is have more senior people overseeing more mid-ranking people. How would I solve it? Well, I think only the government can do this. It needs to impose an immediate 25% cut on all senior officers of 06 and above. And when I say immediate, it's like get rid of them within 6 months and start delegating more, give more responsibility down to junior people. If we don't do that, we're just going to lose our way through the next war, because we now have committees where you have service chiefs are just one of about 30 people in a committee. Most of the people in those committee meetings have no idea or no interest in military affairs and make exceedingly poor decisions about them. But at the end of the day, I don't know whether the ADF can solve this problem anymore. I think it needs to be imposed from without.
Thanks, sir. A similar question, actually, from Lieutenant Colonel Raffin. Rate command accountability. Do you have any advice for commanders about establishing culture where unethical behaviour, if it occurs, will be reported and addressed early?
Well, you've got to set the example. And, as a brigade commander, I sacked 3 company commanders over a 15-month period. Now, these were pretty simple decisions because what they did was so bad they kind of sacked themselves. But at least one of them had been performing this way for years in advance. And people said to me, why did it take so long for someone to get rid of this individual? At the end of the day, commanders have to make the hard decisions, not the easy one when it comes to this kind of behaviour. I think, too, that we're very good at defining what is unacceptable failure, and that's good. I mean, we've come a long way in nurturing good behaviour in our organisation, notwithstanding some ongoing failures in addressing it in our institution. We're not perfect, but at least we aspire to be. I would accompany defining unacceptable failure with defining acceptable failure. I think we're very poor at that. We have to define what kind of failures are tolerated or even encouraged, so that our people can learn the best possible lessons so they don't fail in wartime. So, I think we need to enforce the unacceptable failures that we've defined, but also better define acceptable failures and allow people to learn.
Thanks, sir. A question from Lieutenant Colonel Gray. Noting our multicultural society, what can we take from Israel and Ukraine in taking our population and imbuing them with ethical attributes for battle?
Well, I think the most important thing is purpose. If you're not giving your people all a purpose, you're not inspiring them. At the end of the day, the Ukrainians and Israeli citizens have purpose. For both of them, particularly in Ukraine, an existential threat allows you to do things and think in ways that we in this country, who, I think are mostly not thinking about these kind of issues, it's a really important purpose. You talk to Ukrainians who are serving on the front line. This is all about defending their country. And yes, it's about the people with them, but they understand what's at stake. And I don't know that many other governments in Western democracies are good at providing purpose anymore. I think there's a deficit of leadership and purpose in most elected governments these days, because I think most of them don't understand governing anymore. I think they understand the constant 24/7 churn of campaigning. And that's very different to leading and governing. And I think we need to get back to the really boring but important stuff of leading and governing. And part of that is providing purpose.
Thanks, sir. A question from Dr. Nabs Keller. Could you comment on how the Israeli Defence Force is balancing legal and ethical responsibilities in the Gaza campaign?
This is a very interesting and obviously an emotional issue for many people. And I'm going back there again in a couple of months this will be one of the issues. Israel clearly decided in its military campaign to take a low risk with its own people. And the problem when you take a low risk with your force posture and aggression in urban operations with your own people, that can only result in one thing, a very high risk to civilians in that AO, and that's what's manifested. Now, I think it's important we look at the reasons why they've taken that without saying it's right or wrong, but why might they have thought that way? First and foremost, 7 October was a very, very profound shock to the country, the kind of shock our country has never experienced, ever. Not just as a proportion of people lost, but how it happened. Now, I've been there. I've walked through the kibbutzim. I've seen the unreleased film of what happened on that day, of who was actually doing this. It wasn't just Hamas. There were thousands of civilians who crossed the border and were also engaging in appalling behaviour. The Israelis see all this, so there's a deficit of empathy for Gazans because they know it wasn't just Hamas, but Gazan civilians who participated in the massacres. But also they know that Hamas was actually voted in, remember, in 2016. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying this is one of the potential drivers. Another driver is that after 7 October arose a profound schism between the military and the citizenry of Israel. The citizen of Israel saw the IDF as having failed them. And I've talked to people who were in the kibbutzim on that day, who defended their families, who waited 12 hours for the IDF to arrive. I've spoken to the Major General who was swimming in Tel Aviv that morning and led a fighting advance into one of the kibbutzim to save his son's family with no help from the IDF. So part of what we're seeing in Gaza as well is a response by the IDF that's trying to re-earn the trust of the Israeli people in the wake of 7 October. Now, clearly that has hurt the reputation internationally of Israel and the IDF and has led to, the resurgence of what was latent anti-Semitism in many places, including our own country, unfortunately. But I think it's not just as simple as Israel's going in killing civilians in Gaza, as much as that is happening. I think we have to look at the deeper kind of drivers for the behaviour that the IDF have engaged in over the last kind of 6-7 month period.
Thanks, sir. A question from Dr. Sanders. Does the perception of existential threat change the calculus of ethical proportionality?
Yes. Absolutely no doubt about that.
Thanks, sir.
But different countries react in different ways. So Israel sees itself as an existential threat, and it's easy to see why. They have a ring of fire. You have Hezbollah to the north. You have Hamas coming in through the West Bank, which no one here is tracking. But, the Israelis have over 30 combat battalions in the West Bank fighting. You have Gaza, you have the Houthis, you have this global resurgence of anti-Semitism. They have reacted in one way, but the Ukrainians have reacted a slightly different way. They have chosen deliberately to fight fair and to fight ethically against the Russians. They do not engage in the torture of civilians in captured areas like the Russians have done consistently and systemically. They do not engage in the arbitrary murder, torture, and castration of prisoners of war like the Russians do. They don't engage in the abuse of prisoners of war like the Russians do. 80% of all released Ukrainian POWs have been tortured by the Russians. So, you know, the Ukrainians have chosen, despite how grim the situation is for their country, to fight fairly, to fight legally, to fight ethically. Now, there's a couple of drivers for that. One, there's no way the West would support them if they didn't do that. But I also think, having spoken to a lot of Ukrainians, that they understand there's a price for the soul of their nation if they don't do that. So, yes, having an existential threat does change the calculus, but different countries do respond in different ways.
Thanks, sir. A related question from Captain Maguire. You provided an email that made comment that Ukrainian civil society saved the country. How would the Australian community react in the same position?
I have a lot of faith in the Australian community. And I know that's not always a widely held or popular view, but I actually think during COVID, our society was magnificent. I think some of our state governments were corrupt and inept, but I think generally society understood balancing individual versus collective rights. It understood that older and more vulnerable people had to be protected. Now, I think the price of that in some states, particularly Victoria, was too high, but I actually think our society and our community responded in a really quite magnificent way compared to some other countries overseas. We do it every time there's a flood, but there's a bushfire. You see this spontaneous, outburst of support. Even you have a look at the Brisbane floods a few years ago. People from inner cities were coming from all over to help people clean out their homes. So I have a lot of faith in the Australian people to respond if they're given the right purpose and they see that purpose. And I'll just illustrate that, not just with an Australian, but a Ukrainian example. Speaking to several Ukrainian senior officers over the last couple of years, they all admit none of them predicted how the Ukrainian people would have responded in this war. All of them, before the war, talked about their young people in the same way that many old white blokes like me talk about young people in Western societies at the moment. They're lazy, they're too obsessed with TikTok, they don't care about anything except themselves. That's how many senior Ukrainians saw their own people before February 2022. I think we need to be very careful in our judgments of younger generations because I've seen them for 35 years come through places like Adfa, Kapuka and that, and I think they're every bit as magnificent as their predecessors.
Thanks, sir. Two related questions, one from Chaplain Petrel. How could you see national service or a form of such playing out in Australia? And related from Flight Lieutenant Rainey. So there are ethical considerations with conscription. Do you think the ADF could get enough volunteer enlistment in a time of conflict without it?
Yeah, they're kind of related. I think national service for me has to be for everyone. That's the most ethical way. It has to be community-centric. So for the vast majority of people, you do it for a year living at home and you serve in either local bushfire brigade, you go out and plant trees, you work for the local council, you work as a driver for the ambulance or a phone operator for the police. That should be the experience for the large proportion of people in this scheme, but it has to be for everyone, male and female. And given the average age of Australians is about 83, 1 year out of that serving your community is not a big ask. Secondly, a proportion of that go into the military, and it should be competitive like the Swedes and other countries do. And quite frankly, when you've got about 350,000 people in Australia turning 18 every year, you don't want all those people in the military and in peacetime. You probably want 5%. Pick the best 5%, and you'll probably get that number volunteering anyway if you do the attraction and recruiting and conditions of service right. So that's the national service model I'd see. The second one is, would you get enough volunteers? Well, it all gets down to purpose. Do people perceive a profound threat to their country, to their family, to their way of life? In the First World War, with a population of about 4 million people, we sustained an entire corps with 5 divisions on the Western Front using volunteers. We could do that again if the Australian people saw the right purpose and had the right leadership.
Thanks, sir. With just the last couple of minutes that we have, I wanted to pose the follow-up question from Lieutenant Colonel Respondek, which related to Dr. Sanders' question. Having had some quite practical examples and operational context to discuss, this is a bit more of a macro question. Are ethics more important in wars of choice versus wars of necessity, or is there no differentiation?
There's no differentiation in my view. Ethics come into play in all walks of life, but if you're a military institution charged with taking life, there's a profound moral and ethical responsibility to do it in accordance with both laws and the values of your society. I don't think it matters what kind of mission you're on. It's all about the use of force on behalf of a nation state, and it has to be done legally and ethically wherever possible.
Thanks very much, sir. Sir, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you with us this morning, and a privilege for so many people in different operational contexts and across the ranks of the military to be able to speak with you directly. So thank you very much for your time. It's been a great morning and a fantastic way to start the symposium.
Thank you.